Forbidden whispers. The weight of secrets is a strange burden. It can make your heart race in the dead of night, leave your skin hot with guilt, and yet, it can also be the most exhilarating thing in the world. For Daniel Hart, a 20-year-old college student, his secret was the kind that would shatter friendships and redefine love in ways he never imagined. It all started on a quiet summer evening. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the setting sun cast golden hues over the sprawling estate of the Callaways. Daniel had been best friends with Ethan Callaway since childhood, their bond unbreakable, their trust unwavering. But lately, Daniel found himself drawn to someone he never should have. A man twice his age, a man who was not only off-limits but dangerously close to his life. Richard Callaway, Ethan's father. The man exuded confidence, his presence commanding attention without a single word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and refined in a way that made him stand apart from other men. His graying temples only added to his allure, the lines around his eyes speaking of wisdom, experience, and an untamed kind of passion. Daniel had ignored his feelings at first, dismissing them as admiration. But admiration did not make his breath hitch whenever Richard entered the room. Admiration did not send shivers down his spine when their hands brushed against each other in passing. It was wrong. It was reckless. But it was inevitable. The first time it happened, Daniel hadn't meant for it to. They had been alone in the study, the house eerily quiet with Ethan gone for the weekend. Daniel was supposed to be picking up a book Ethan had borrowed, but instead he found himself trapped under Richard's piercing gaze. "You seem troubled," Richard said, his voice smooth like aged whiskey. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." Richard stepped closer, the scent of his cologne intoxicating. "About?" Daniel hesitated. The tension between them had been simmering for months, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. It was in the way Richard's eyes lingered, the way his voice softened when he spoke to Daniel, the way he always found reasons to touch him, however briefly. "Things I shouldn't be," Daniel finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard's gaze darkened. He reached out, fingers brushing against Daniel's jaw, tilting his chin up. "And yet, here you are." The kiss that followed was slow, deliberate, a test of boundaries neither of them had the strength to uphold. Daniel's world tilted as Richard's lips moved against his, firm yet tender, tasting of mint and something deeper, something forbidden. He knew it was a mistake, knew the risks, but in that moment, all logic faded. It wasn't just about desire, it was about the way Richard made him feel seen, understood. He wasn't just Ethan's best friend anymore. He was Daniel, a man who longed to be cherished. But secrets have a way of unraveling. And some loves are too dangerous to survive. As their affair deepened, stolen moments became their lifeline. Late-night rendezvous, hushed whispers, lingering glances across the dinner table. Every second was a risk, every touch an invitation to disaster. But neither could walk away. "Do you regret this?" Daniel asked one night, lying beneath Richard, their bodies slick with sweat and tangled in sheets that smelled of sin. Richard's fingers traced lazy circles on Daniel's bare chest. "How could I regret something that makes me feel alive?" But reality loomed like a storm cloud. They weren't just two men indulging in passion, they were playing with fire. And when Ethan began to notice the stolen glances, the quiet tension, the way his father always seemed a little too aware of Daniel's presence, the walls began to close in. One wrong move, one careless slip, and their secret would be exposed. And secrets never stay buried for long. It was a crisp autumn evening when the first crack in their carefully constructed illusion appeared. Daniel had been at the Callaway estate for dinner, seated across from Ethan as they laughed over childhood memories. Richard sat at the head of the table, his gaze steady but unreadable. But as the night wore on, Daniel felt the weight of Richard's stare, the ghost of his touch still lingering from the night before. Ethan's laughter faded as he studied Daniel, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You okay? You've been acting weird lately." Daniel forced a chuckle. "Just tired. School's been a lot." Ethan nodded but didn't look convinced. "You sure? You haven't been yourself." Before Daniel could respond, Richard cleared his throat. Maybe he just needs a break. You boys have been working hard. His voice was casual, but Daniel knew better. Later that night, as Daniel snuck into Richard's study, the door shut behind him with a quiet click. Richard was waiting, arms crossed, eyes dark with something unreadable. Ethan's suspicious. Daniel swallowed hard. I know. Richard exhaled, stepping forward until they were inches apart. We have to be more careful. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing against Richard's. I don't want to stop. Richard caught his hand, squeezing gently. Neither do I. But fate had other plans. The next morning, Ethan found a text on Daniel's phone, one he was never supposed to see. And just like that, the truth began to unravel. Ethan stormed into Daniel's apartment later that evening, his face twisted with confusion and betrayal. Tell me this isn't true. Daniel's heart pounded. Ethan threw the phone onto the table, the incriminating text message glowing on the screen. You and my dad? Silence hung heavy between them, suffocating. Ethan let out a sharp laugh, one devoid of humor. I trusted you. You were my best friend. Daniel stepped forward, but Ethan held up a hand. Don't. Just don't. Tears burned at the back of Daniel's eyes. Ethan, it wasn't planned. It just happened. My dad. Ethan repeated, his voice cracking. Before Daniel could speak, the door swung open, and Richard stood there, his expression grim. Ethan, let's talk. Ethan shook his head. No. I don't want to hear anything from you. Richard sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I never meant to hurt you. Then you shouldn't have done it, Ethan spat, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You both should have known better. Daniel reached for Ethan's hand, but Ethan pulled away. We're done. I don't even know who you are anymore. As Ethan stormed out, Daniel felt his world shatter around him. The secret was out. The damage was done. And nothing would ever be the same again. As Daniel sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had lost his best friend. His love affair with Richard was now a storm of pain and uncertainty. Would Richard fight for him? Would Ethan ever forgive him? Or was this the end of everything Daniel had ever known? The doorbell rang. Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding. He opened the door to find Richard standing there, eyes filled with something Daniel couldn't quite name. Daniel, Richard said softly, I'm not letting you go. The storm had only just begun. The door closed behind Richard, sealing them in a silence thick with reckoning. Daniel's apartment felt smaller now, the air charged with the aftermath of Ethan's fury and Richard's unyielding resolve. We can't keep doing this in the shadows, Richard said, his voice low but steady. His hand brushed Daniel's cheek, calloused fingers lingering like a promise. I want to protect you. But hiding, it's poisoning us. Daniel stepped back, the gravity of those words clawing at his chest. Ethan will never forgive us. And if we go public... Let me handle Ethan, Richard interrupted, his jaw tightening. I'll make him understand. Daniel laughed bitterly. Understand what? That you chose me over him? The truth hung between them, sharp and unyielding. Richard's gaze faltered, betraying the guilt he'd masked for months. Later, tangled in the sheets of Richard's bed, a place that had become both sanctuary and prison, Daniel traced the scars on Richard's torso, remnants of a life before him. What happens next? Richard captured his hand, pressing it to his lips. We fight. Ethan's revenge began subtly. A screenshot of Richard's text to Daniel, blurred but damning, surfaced on campus forums. Whispers followed Daniel like shadows. Homewrecker, gold digger, freak. His roommate moved out. His professors averted their eyes. It's just gossip, Richard insisted, pouring Daniel a glass of wine in the dim glow of his study. It'll fade. But the next morning, a photo of them kissing at a secluded cafe splashed across the Cedar Hill Gazette. The caption hissed, Local Tycoon's Taboo Affair. Richard's phone erupted, board members, lawyers, his sister demanding answers. Daniel stared at the paper, nausea rising. Who took this? Richard crumpled the headline, his composure cracking. Someone who wants us destroyed. The blackmail arrived in a plain envelope. $500,000, or the next photos go viral. Richard recognized the cafe in the grainy shots, the same one where he'd met his first lover, a graduate student named Julian, 20 years prior. Julian had vanished after Richard ended things, leaving only a note: secrets always surface. History repeating itself, Richard muttered, pouring a drink. Daniel watched him, unease coiling in his gut. You never told me about him, Daniel said. Richard's laugh was hollow. He was a mistake. You're not. But the lie tasted sour. That night, Daniel found Julian's obituary in an old yearbook. Suicide, 2003. Ethan's downward spiral escalated. Cops found him drunkenly vandalizing Daniel's car, screaming, "You ruined everything." Richard bailed him out, but Ethan spat in his face. "You're dead to me." Daniel begged Richard to reconcile with his son. "Go to him. Please." Richard's voice broke. "If I walk away now, I will lose you forever." "You already have," Daniel whispered. Their fight ended in silence, Richard retreating to the study, Daniel packing his bags. The video dropped at dawn, Richard and Daniel in the study, their bodies entwined, filmed through a window. By noon, #Callaway scandal trends globally. Richard's company stock plummeted. Protesters gathered outside Daniel's apartment, chanting, "Predator." Richard arrived, disheveled and desperate. "Come with me. I have a cabin upstate, we'll disappear." Daniel hesitated, tears blurring his vision. "I can't. I won't be your secret anymore." A brick shattered the window. Richard shielded Daniel, blood streaking his temple. "Then let me be yours." The cabin was a relic of Richard's past, wood smoke and moth-eaten quilts. For a week, they pretended the world didn't exist. They cooked, hiked, made love by firelight. Daniel traced Richard's face, memorizing him. "What if this is all we get?" Richard kissed his palm. "It's enough." But reality clawed back. A call from Ethan, "Mom's awake." Richard's wife, Clara, had been in a coma for a decade. Her revival was a miracle and a death sentence. "She remembers," Ethan hissed. "She knows what you are." Clara's gaunt face filled the hospital room. "You promised her you'd stop," she rasped, eyes on Richard. "After Julian, you swore." Daniel froze. Richard crumpled. "Clara, You killed our daughter," Clara whispered. "Your affair, the accident, and now you'll kill him too." Daniel staggered back, the truth ablaze. "A daughter? A car crash? A cover-up?" Ethan stood in the doorway, tears streaming. "You said Mom died in a fall." Richard reached for him. "I wanted to protect you." "From you!" Ethan screamed. Daniel fled. Richard's confession chased him. "I never told you about her. I couldn't." At dawn, he stood on the Callaway Estates dock, the lake reflecting a bruised sky. Richard found him hollow-eyed. "I'm sorry." "You're a liar," Daniel said, voice trembling. "You let me love a ghost." Richard's kiss was a plea. "I love you. Not the past." But Daniel pulled away. Love isn't enough. A year later, Daniel sat in a Paris cafe, the taste of espresso bitter on his tongue. His memoir draft glared from his laptop, forbidden whispers. Across the street, a familiar figure paused. Richard, older, wearier, clutching a bouquet of lilies. Their eyes met. Richard mouthed, "I'm sorry." Daniel closed his laptop, heart racing. The waiter asked if he wanted another drink. "No," he said, standing. "I'm done hiding." He stepped into the sunlight, the ghosts of yesterday whispering, but no longer binding.